So I'm proud to introduce our next speaker. And before I do that, I just want to remind people to share your questions in the chat box so that we can really have a great conversation at the Q&A period at the end of the next presentation. Our next presentation is with Raja Ramachandran, who will be talking with us today about digitizing the dairy story, or how blockchain technology can digitize the dairy supply chain and allow stakeholders to collaboratively harness the power of information sharing and storytelling with consumer engagement. So please join me in welcoming Raja Ramachandran. Raja is the co-founder of Ripe.io, a technology company creating the blockchain of food to help the food supply chain achieve transparency, efficiency, and approved value to solve problems around traceability, food safety, quality assurance, and regulatory compliance. Raja is a serial entrepreneur, most recently on the founding team and headed product development at R3, the world's largest financial institutions consortium for blockchain deployment. Raja has had a 20-year career working at Bank of America, Citi, Silicon Valley Bank, and Wells Fargo. Raja is passionate about connecting technologies and how they can be utilized to revolutionize ways to create a more sustainable and healthier food business. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ramachandran.
Well, thanks, Sherry. I really appreciate that. Really wonderful introduction. Probably not as deserved as it would sound. And I really enjoyed that last video. That's just terrific that you're helping and ODI is really helping out, the youth and getting into this area. So, again, thanks to you and ODI for having me. And hopefully we can learn a little bit about blockchains and what they mean and the implications of digitizing, produce types, whether it's dairy, beef, specialty crop, and so on. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through this. Let's see, let's bring up this fella. Hopefully you're all able to see. Sherry, just quickly, you're able to see well?
We can see it.
Okay, great. So Ripe.io, what are we and what do we do? We started back in 2017 as a bit of an offshoot of an understanding about how blockchain technologies could be used beyond financial institutions, which is an area that I come from. And so, our roots really came from an entity that produced a project called the Internet of Tomatoes. It was to track literally from seed all the way to taste, and figuring out what actually constitutes the factors of input in farming and transportation and cold chain, and ultimately getting it into the consumer's taste buds. And so we learned quite a lot about all of the different data attributes and the activities that surround a simple sort of supply chain, say around just say tomatoes. And through that, we really start to look at, well, how can ledgers actually help in multiple produce types? And so traceability is one component of what we enable. We allow customers, or from farmers all the way to consumer products good companies, to understand where things came from, what happened during its growth and transportation and transformation, ultimately into the consumer. An area that we're actually spending quite a lot of time on is sustainability. In other words, how do you prove sustainability by using ledger systems, which gives you a sense of independence and allowing you to make assertions, but have consensus with folks. And really, in the end, we enable quality assessment. In other words, what actually constitutes the quality of your produce item, and how does that actually relate to ultimately, say, economic value? So one of the things that we've seen over the past several years, and particularly, sort of in like us being a bit outside of the industry and coming in, is this observation around really some massive changes that you're all experiencing and we're experiencing as well. Number one, this notion of things like robotics. You're seeing all sorts of activity, from satellite systems to drones to automated harvesting and on, that are actually playing a big part. And one of the capstones of such a thing is that they are digital. And so in the future, as that activity gets placed onto electronic computing, this becomes a real signal as to what's actually happening in field and in the air and so on. Sustainability is another piece where I don't think you can get away from a conversation with anybody in your business that doesn't want to know what is it that we need to portray about sustainability and how does it tie into larger goals, whether it's ESG related, CO2 equivalents and GHG reduction and so on. Transparency is another piece. There's this constant discussion around, well, we need more transparency. Well, the issue is, well, how do you achieve transparency? And then how do you relate that transparency into a value proposition where the participants of that transparency get value through things like maybe regulatory compliance, making sure that, you fulfill on contracts, that folks get paid fairly and so on. So there's quite a lot that's baked into it. And then personalization, I think that where all this digital activity goes is that you will ultimately have an app where all of your food, as a consumer, will be personalized and it will be to your family's profile. So that's one of the long-term trends that we see happening. So what happens in digitizing things? Well, and that I just walked through a little bit, like at the edges of blockchain activity is this whole new notion of something called non-fungible tokens, or just basically tokenizing a thing. And so as an example, there's a piece of artwork by this gentleman named Beeble, where he put in his digital artwork for 5,000 days every single day and placed it into this effectively this cache where you can see each of the individual components. And so NFTs are this weird thing where you can tokenize utilizing blockchain, and this person sold it for $69 million. It's probably the craziest thing that we've seen, but this notion of digitization captures moments in time that is immutable. And so in a way, this is the beginnings of how we think food is also going to evolve too. So we've seen it in airlines, for example, in computing. But these days we're really in the middle of what actually constitutes digitization of a food supply chain. And so if you look at it, you look at all these industries like music and television and broadcast and movies and entertainment and books and commerce, they've all been digitized to an extent. And you know what? Food's no different. We're seeing it with Panera. We've worked with Sweetgreen, for example. And this is a trend that will ultimately play out over the next years. I would say that these are early days about what consumer brands are doing to explain this incredibly complicated set of events that get us, our food. And so this is McDonald's in the UK about talking about, their milk ingredients and what actually goes in the Happy Meal milk bottles. And so I would say that this is a fairly crude and early way in which brands can take information from the supply chain and then relate it to you as a consumer. And so that's one piece of it. Another one that we thought was actually quite interesting is Panera has gone to a much higher level of detail in terms of what actually constitutes a carbon footprint, or in this case, is there a carbon intensity index that actually describes your bowl of soup, your sandwich, the potato salad that you may pick up there, and so on. And so this is probably the beginnings of the kind of informational output that is pulled from the supply chain that gets to a consumer. So two implications of such a thing. Number one, how do you capture enough data that actually makes sense? Number two, how do you trust it? In other words, did you get confirmation about that GHG emission, and how was that achieved? Was it through a device? Was it through people? Was it through multiple third parties? And that's actually an area that we're actually spending some time in terms of how it is that we look at evaluating a digital component of your soup. And so this is, we think, the long-term trends and the demands by consumer. I wouldn't say that this is like the immediate thing, but if you can look at a franchise like Panera going to this level of detail, you can only imagine what the future holds. So let's talk a little bit about blockchain and digitization. We won't get very technical because honestly, there's nothing you can gain from it. We'll talk a little bit more about how it's deployed and how does it quickly work and what value do you really get out of such a thing. Well, the first thing that we've identified in the marketplace and we've been witnessing is that amongst the use cases or the ways in which blockchain are used, these are some of the larger potentials that are out there. And if you look at it, provenance actually turns out to be one of the biggest, best uses of blockchain, so that you can look at, goods and tracking and understanding what actually happens in the supply chain. And, you want to solve for problems for things like fraud or contamination or counterfeiting. And so that is a huge area of potential growth for the use of things like a blockchain. You probably heard a lot about the financial markets advancing their use of payments and financial instruments. More and more you're starting to see tokens being potentially used for things like holding assets. Bitcoin is one, for example. And in the future, maybe even more merchant transactions. Identity is a big deal. In other words, identity may sound simple in its simple phrase, but it's an incredibly complicated thing. About, well, what actually constitutes who you are and what you are. And so having blockchains actually, will make a big difference in that. Contract management is a big deal, because once you have information on a chain about, say, supply chain events on, say, an invoice, you can actually automate that and make it work so that as a contract gets fulfilled, you have affirmation that that's true. And then ultimately you can manage your payments as such a thing. And then ultimately customer engagement. So this is, I would say, just as a keeping point, remember this, because these are probably the areas that you're going to read a lot about when it comes to blockchain usage. Now, what is blockchain, and what's actually a distributed ledger? All blockchains really are another form or an alternate form of a database. And so in a database, typically you've got, well, in this particular case, you have a ledger. The ledger actually just serves as the data capture point for any kind of information. And the idea is to organize it based on a language that you can understand, or a reference database. So the ledger actually is quite similar in some sense, not exactly, but to a database. Digital transactions is another piece of it. In other words, once information is on there, what can you do with it? It could be a payment. It could be a letter of credit. It could actually be an assertion saying that we had, 140 cattle today, produce milk at this level with a bunch of detail behind it. And those are assertions. And so these transactions run through the system so that everybody can see it. And then ultimately what blockchains do really well is they use cryptography to seal the actual data record. And only a company or entities that have what's called a private key, it's basically a digital key that unlocks it uniquely. And so whoever has that key can unlock that record. Other than that, it's permanent, because you now have a timestamp and you can actually trace it all the way back. So that's ultimately that's the makeup of such a thing. And then why do you use like distributed ledgers when you can use databases? These are the conditions that really need to exist in an ecosystem, so that all of a sudden the value of the blockchain and these shared ledgers actually become important. So you need multiple parties. And those multiple parties want to share facts. And those facts can be seen by all parties that are entitled to see that information. So what it does is it resolves for reconciliations around a fact, so that you're looking at one record, whether it's an invoice or a compliance record, or it could be a video of what's actually occurred. It could be a labor attestation, and so on. Shared logic, in other words, what makes sense for our supply chain, and how do we incorporate that as a way to automate some of the activity, literally from say the point of milking all the way to the point of, to the processing and then barcoding it on a carton of milk, for example. The idea of timeliness is also an important factor so that everyone can see it. But the biggest thing about why blockchains and distributed ledgers are different than databases is that there's no single entity that manages it. In other words, it is self-managed by the participants who create the relationships, who create the data, who create the consumption of the data, and applications that sit on top of it. And so there's no third party that biases any of that information. And so this has to exist in order for blockchains to make sense. Other than that, you can actually use other technology tools to do so. And then it kind of looks along these lines, which is sort of our architecture, where we have public sort of information like weather information that can be submitted and consumed by anybody in the supply chain, or restricted data, which allows you with those private keys to be able to go ahead and figure out who in the chain you'd like to have see that information. And so our platform breaks it up that way. So that's the backdrop on, well, what generally is a blockchain sort of structure, why, and then what are sort of the criteria that make sense for it to go there. Now, I'll walk you through very specific examples of, well, how do you actually do it in the dairy industry? And so we had done some work with the Dairy Farmers of America when we were actually in an accelerator of theirs. And so it allowed us to actually take a hard look at the real world, and then taking a look at where all these different data sets are, and how can we take a real world, entire ecosystem, supply chain and activities, digitize it, and then create some kind of value in an application. And so we spent actually quite a lot of time at farms and taking a hard look at, like, what's the constitution of what actually occurs, at the farm level, at the farm gate, and very specifically about the profile, any kind of IDs, geolocations, a whole series of things that would go on. And then also through the milking process, we actually tracked, farm that was picked up by the truckers into a specific processor in Wisconsin, and then looked at the operational logs so that we could add in their pasteurization data, the date that they were processed, and so on, and then ultimately barcoded into a carton. And in that, we were able to get a ton of information that I'll go through in a second, about such a thing. And then taking in any kind of cold storage, trucking information, and ultimately to a retailer, and then how it affects you as a consumer. So by analyzing all of that, a next step was to actually go, well, we have to have a language of food, or a language so that we can actually rationalize all of these varying things so that it fits some idea of, like, well, what do you want to explain, or what do you want to see in your provenance or chain of custody that actually makes sense to you? And so the idea is to take real life information, categorize it, create a digital a definition of such a thing, and then ultimately it gets to a point where it can actually show value to a consumer brand, for example. Now, this is really where the work begins. And so why I'm showing this, and I don't want people to be overwhelmed by this, but in essence, this is kind of what you all do. And so this shouldn't be entirely foreign in terms of how this all works in terms of your workflow. So the way that we create a digital, I guess, reflection of what actually occurs in the dairy space, it all begins obviously at the farm. We try to take a look at the physical world and identify, who they are, who are the participants, what stage of the cycle are they in terms of the creation of dairy, looking at the milking entities, whether it's the processor or so on, what happens during transportation, and what information is actually necessary to achieve such a thing. And then quality, we have a lot of different terminology that reflects what actually constitutes quality, of the milk. And then with a partner of ours, a company called Neogen, we have access to testing for things like antibiotic residues or mycotoxin in the inputs and feed, and on and on. And so it allows us to actually include third-party information as a piece of it. So we could even have veterinarian records or whatever it might be, ultimately to the processor. And there's a whole series of sustainability information that we're actually starting to include, particularly around animal welfare, environmental stewardship, certainly on food safety, a lot to do with labor and community management. And so we're seeing that kind of model emerge from, like, say, the Dairy Farmers has a sustainability index. We work with the National Pork Board. They have a very similar set of pillars in which they're trying to define sustainability for pork producers. And what does that mean? And we're seeing the same in soybean and crop protection and poultry and seafood and on and on. And so all that means is, in order to get a rational sense of, I define sustainability this way, how do I connect that sustainability information to how you define it? Whether you're a bank, whether you're a CPG, a buyer, a regulator. And so in the end, digitizing it allows you to have all of this on one piece. And so these all become data elements, which we actually have in our own database that describes it. So when a farm wants to come on board, you'll have a series of data attributes that you can define how do you want to contribute information or how do you want to see information. And I'm going to give you an example of screens that we show that actually show you real life how this all works. And so by doing all of this, we understand the entirety of the workflow. I'm sorry, and take a look at each of the components that drive the data that sit on that ledger, as I talked about, right? And so this is where all the information gets stored, time-stamped, and then placed, and then it shows the ownership of that data. In other words, who contributed to it, and where does that attribution go to? And then ultimately traceability, identifiers, and so on as a piece of it. And so by doing so, you get, like, it is complicated, but when you're able to go ahead and put all this together, you'll have an incredibly complete record of the whole thing. And so this is a digital representation of each of those segments, whether they're EID tags or vaccination records or quality assessment, and each of those are placed on the blockchain. The difference is everybody can have access to it. So what does this look like in real life? So this is a simple example of someone creating a new shipment. So you'll have either a mobile, device, or you can go onto a website, or we can actually upload information from spreadsheets to clouds or whatever. And then you'll go about creating your first sort of like order activity. We'll have a map of where things are. If there's IoT devices that measure temperature and humidity, that too can be placed. And then ultimately give me a dashboard of your activity in terms of your actual logistics, purchasing orders, and so on. This one's a little bit more detailed about what you can, oops, 1 second, I might just bring up, I'm gonna just show you what this actually looks like from this perspective. So this is a more detailed look as to, I apologize. This is a more detailed look as to how someone would actually use this, like an operator or a farm, showing a particular farm, what's the settled amount of carbon footprints that we can do, where's it going to, quality details. Again, we're just displaying what was presented. And so in that sense, with say our partner Neogen, we can actually get quite a lot of information, about the testing that went through, whether it's for safety or, a genomics or phenomics, run as well. And we even have these as part of our profile. So through the third party, we're actually able to get a high level of detailed information, not for the consumer, but for supply chain participants that really want to take a hard look at this. And then ultimately, how this ultimately plays out in terms of its transportation. So, and in the end, one of some of the things that we tried to do with the Dairy Farmers of America is we wanted to portray, well, how's this going to look, not only for our participants, but also a consumer. And so in that sense, you could do simple things like enable sort of their gold rating standards as part of their best practices as they go through, as well as some level of traceability. We've even taken it to an extent where we actually work with Sweetgreen. Granted, this is not dairy, this is goat milk. But, with this particular company, we actually went from literally from the milking process all the way to tasting at the restaurants themselves. And so we correlated all of the data against, our food science director put together these flavor profiles. And so they're able to figure out things like bitterness, firmness, and et cetera, as to how that would be against the actual dairy that was actually created, in this case, goat cheese. And we actually had live taste tests at restaurants in Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Boston and Washington, D.C. So this is with hundreds and hundreds of people that have helped actually identify, well, what could be a taste profile. So these are some of the things that you can do when you start to digitize the information that actually flows through. And so it really opens up an incredible world of possibilities for producers, supply chain participants, for buyers, and ultimately consumers. What's the future? I would say that something like this is probably going to become quite commonplace. It's already in Asia, for example, where in China, particularly, everything is, QR coded or barcoded, where you click on and you're actually able to see your food. And I think the driver there is around food safety and assuring that, they have some record of what happened and what, where did things come from and so on, particularly from imported food. And so in that sense, that kind of wave, I'm not so sure will replicate itself in the United States. I think the US user will only have so much patience to click on every single item of food and see things. But I do think that this is what will end up happening, as opposed to a click. This will become an automated valet into your own personalized app. In other words, update me when I go through the grocery store, and let's ensure that I get the right sort of lactate-based milk, or these types of cheeses where my kids don't get sick, and on and on and on. So this will become much more of a personalized component that reflects your nutritional needs, your preferences, time of day, your families, your friends, and so on. And so we see that as part of the future. We're starting to work with others where we start to look at tackling, CO2 equivalents and reductions in all of it. And so you've probably heard of companies like Mutual, where you reduce the enteric methane emissions by feed supplements. They have a mix of ginger and lemons and so on, and Future Feed uses seaweed. And the whole idea is to reduce methane through burping. And again, this becomes a digital record onto the entirety of the flow of that information. We work with a company called Agra Energy, and they actually have biodigesters on farms where they convert that methane on site immediately to, say, fuel. And they're currently doing jet fuel right now out of Wisconsin as a test point, and then they've got a map on how they produce it. And so this is actually a transition to a full carbon reduction, program, where the actual refinery of methane on the farm into jet fuel is zero carbon output. And so, there's things like this that are happening. And then, of course, you're probably looking at a whole series of actors that really want to improve the space on not only sustainability, but well-being, and a whole series of factors to improve the overall quality and the output of the entire industry. And so we feel like we're right in the middle of what are some significant seismic changes from a physical world to a digital world. And so we look to help work with folks like yourselves to enable such a thing. And with that, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Raja. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but
Yeah.
I think you did an amazing job of giving us a really great introduction to this topic. And I would argue that we could devote a whole session to this next year in the conference. So we want to thank you for taking the time to join us today and sharing a little bit more about blockchain.
No, great. And Sherry, look, I mean, I've seen a bunch of questions. If there's some way to capture that, I mean, I'm happy to answer it back to you in an email. And if you want to portray it back to everybody, I'm happy to do so. Or people can contact me directly too.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks.